Welcome to the Commentary Magazine Daily Podcast. Today is Wednesday, March 11th, 2025. I am John Podhoretz, the editor of Commentary Magazine. Excited to tell you that we are closing the April issue today, and we should have a bunch of its contents up tomorrow, Thursday, and on Friday, featuring a remarkable roster of political, cultural, and social essays, including our cover by Tevi Troy, which is called In Praise of Big Pharma. So here's a piece you haven't read and you are going to read and you are going to be enlightened by. Our own Matt Continetti has a piece called The Putin Trap, which is the question of why we are now on our sixth or seventh administration since the year 2000 seeking to make nice with the Russian dictator who fleeces us every single time. And so there's much more in there. We'll talk about it as the days progress. With me, as always, executive editor Abe Greenwald. Hi, Abe.
Hi, John.
The aforementioned Washington commentary columnist Matthew Continetti. Hi, Matt.
Hi, John.
And senior editor Seth Mandel. Hi, Seth.
Hi, John.
So there's a point yesterday afternoon when I just gave up. I don't understand anything. I've now decided that you shouldn't be listening to me anymore because I am completely clueless and beyond my ability to reckon with or have any sense of the chaos that the world is displaying. I don't understand the Ukraine peace deal. I don't understand why Donald Trump is selling cars for the world's richest man who doesn't need him to sell cars. I don't understand what exactly is going on with the House and the continuing resolution. I don't understand why liberals are turning Mahmud Khalil into the new Luigi Mangione. I don't understand why they made Luigi Mangione into a hero as opposed to a murderer. I don't understand. That's why I'm turning to Matt Continetti to explain this while I cry silently in the corner.
I want you to know, as in therapy, I think this is a good moment that you reach this moment of understanding and learning and self-knowledge, and from here there's growth, John.
Or Socrates, right?
Yes.
I know that I know nothing. I've achieved perfect ignorance.
The philosophical wisdom has descended upon you.
Yes,
that's right. How many psychiatrists does it take to change a light bulb? Only one, but the light bulb has to really want to change.
Right.
John, I don't want to change. I just want to go on vacation. Anyway,
I have a brief comment on Mahmoud before I go to Ukraine and the CR. I was reading the coverage of Mahmud Khalil's deportation proceedings, and in the New York Times story in yesterday's paper, they said, it's unclear what he did except become involved in the mostly peaceful protests at Columbia. So the return,
it's back.
The return of mostly peaceful.
It's back.
It's back. Yeah. So I was very much amused by that New York Times story.
I mean, he did not. To be fair to Mahmud Khalil, while he is a supporter and an abettor and an aider of a monstrous terrorist organization, he did not set a dollar store on fire because there are no dollar stores in Morningside Heights, the location of Columbia and Barnard. But
still, those were mostly peaceful protests at Columbia and Barnard.
Yes.
So Ukraine. I thought yesterday was a good moment, mainly because as a result of the deal that the United States and Ukraine reached in Saudi Arabia, America has resumed our military aid and our intelligence sharing with Ukraine. There's been a lot of, I think, confusion about what Trump's aim is here. Trump's aim has always been to end the war in Ukraine. But I believe that he has viewed this as a sequence, a diplomatic sequence. And before presenting terms of any ceasefire to Russia, he had to get Ukraine to be on his side, to also accept that this would be a ceasefire that they would do, they would abide by. And the reluctance of Ukraine, the understandable reluctance, because Russia's killing its people every day, to sign on to this plan is what led to the blow up in the Oval Office a couple weeks ago. But the upshot was that yesterday, Ukraine and U.S. positions are now aligned. And as Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, said, it's now up to Russia Now, I happen to believe, with historical evidence behind me, that Russia will not respond to this ceasefire proposal.
Well, it did respond, right? It attacked Kyiv and Kharkiv.
Yeah.
Yesterday, after the announcement that Ukraine was agreeing to the ceasefire,
Right.
which is why you don't necessarily want to agree to a ceasefire in the middle of a war without both sides agreeing at the same time.
Well, and remember, the morning of the meeting, Ukraine sent a big drone attack into Moscow. Most of it was shot down, but the war is still going on.
Yeah.
But what we've heard from Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, is that it's a non-starter. They're not going to agree to peacekeepers. Putin, of course, has never changed his demands on Ukraine: neutrality, disarmament, so-called denazification, which means an entirely new government. And so what I take from what happened yesterday is that at least America is back supporting Ukraine, and that's an important step with this administration.
Okay, so here's the reason that I'm confused. So the Ukrainian government, basically backed into a corner, has agreed to American terms. Let's face it, right? It said, okay, we agree to a ceasefire as long as Russia agrees to a ceasefire, which of course that is perfectly rational. I mean, there is no such thing as a one-sided ceasefire. That's just surrender. One-sided ceasefire is capitulation or appomattox or something like that. That's what a one-sided ceasefire is. It's like getting a 2-year vacation without pay from your work. You're fired. It's just not being called being fired. So they have ceded to reality. The reality being that the Trump administration had decided to treat them almost like they were an enemy. They needed to change the terms of that relationship. And so they have made this agreement that is probably relatively low stakes to them because of what you think, Matt, right? Which is that Russia is not going to make a deal. Therefore, Ukraine will have played ball, will not have the Trump's aims will not be secured, and the arms and the intelligence sharing begin to flow again for another 4 days until Trump decides to cut it off again because he doesn't have a play with Moscow and he's got to play with Ukraine because he's a bully and Ukraine's smaller and less strong and is not completely.
Yeah, well, we're not there yet. Right now, we're
not there yet, but here's where we are with the Trump administration. Trump administration is, I'm putting on tariffs. No, I'm not. Yes, I am. No, I'm not. Here they are. No, they're not. Ontario, don't do that. That's not nice. Stop cutting off our electricity. We'll let things go back to Canada. No, we won't. Israel should unleash hell. No, we should let 10 hostages out. No, Hamas is worth dealing with. No, it's not. Yes, it is. That is what is going on with the Trump administration in terms of its public diplomacy. So assuming that the deal that has been made with Ukraine is not permanent, but is actually now the new basis for going forward, I think is a fool's errand. You can't assume that Trump won't wake up Friday morning and decide that the reason that Russia isn't playing ball is because, Zelensky is impossible or something.
But I think there's another possibility, which is that Russia, quote, plays ball with the goal of imposing terms on some permanent end to the war that is entirely favorable to Russia, in which case I think Trump will then return to pressuring Zelensky to take that. And if Zelensky doesn't want that, which he won't, then Trump will make Ukraine the enemy again. I think that's a distinct possibility.
That seems uncharacteristic of Putin. That kind of game, whatever his game is, and he's, as Matt's piece in the April commentary suggests, Putin does somehow emanate signals to people and Americans that there's room to play with him. But he tends not to do what you're suggesting, which is kind of Machiavellian, take a step back in order to take 2 steps forward 2 weeks from now. That would seem weak, or it would seem like you're capitulating. And that's not, he would tend to sort of kill 200 Russians and say the Ukrainians did it, or something like that. Like not
that could happen too.
Like seem like he's.
I think returning to your initial point of Socratic humility. We need to just approach this and say we don't really know what's going to happen. We do know that after his meeting with the Qataris today and tomorrow, I think, Steve Witkoff is going to go to Moscow and meet with Putin again. And we're not clear what will be communicated. Last time he was with Putin, it was for several hours. Maybe I side in the realm of speculation a little bit with Abe. Maybe Putin sees some kind of advantage here to be maybe nice and say, 30 days, okay. The Eastern Front in Ukraine has gone pretty poorly for Russia. In the past year, they've barely gained any ground. Their equipment is pretty terrible. On the other hand, in Kursk, which is the piece of Russia that Ukraine invaded last year, the Russian forces seem to be making advances. So Putin has a choice here. Does he want to freeze the lines where they are, which might help him in the east of Ukraine and hurt him in Kursk, or does he just want to continue the war? We really don't know, though. As you say, I mean, most likely he'll continue the war.
And the Kursk part, I think, is important, which is some credit to the administration and Zelensky for working this out now, because if they manage to get Russia to stop now even for 30 days, really stop, including Kursk, it would make a big difference. Because if Russia sweeps Ukraine out of Kursk, the war is over. There's no more chips for Ukraine to play at the bargaining table. That was the one that they were able to say, we have some of your territory. You have lots of our territory. It's not going to be an even trade, but we'll take some of our territory back, please. And if Russia is able to just take Kursk back completely, you don't really see much leverage for Ukraine, which is also why I have my doubts about Russia agreeing to this or abiding by this, because it feels like Russia is within striking distance of sort of checkmating Ukraine at the negotiating table, taking away any leverage that they might have. And it seems unlike Putin to not just go and take this thing that's there. And the only reason they would do it, I suppose, is if Ukraine is putting up enough of a fight and Russia's forces are stretched thin enough that they really don't feel like they can march through Kursk right now. But I do think that's probably the key point to watch for the ceasefire, especially because anything that Russia does during a ceasefire, they're going to claim is outside the bounds of a ceasefire. They're going to send in the little green men to Kursk because it's on Russian territory. They're going to play all sorts of games. So that's the area to watch closely.
Fair enough, but I will say this, which is that philosophical humility, since that is the theme of this episode of the podcast, this is not philosophical humility. It is simply sort of not rueful understanding, but some kind of understanding. Somehow, so far in the 3 years of this war, Ukraine manages to pull rabbits out of hats. Like I'm not saying that Russia can't overwhelm and overrun Kursk and take it back from the Ukrainians. They can, but they haven't yet. They're doing better. But the invention of the Ukrainian military offensive against Russia, the inventive qualities that they have been able to pull out, desperation and the need for national survival have generated, suggests that Putin would be right to fear pulling himself off the chessboard for 30 days, right?
I would add to that. I noticed in my podcast feed last night an emergency episode of the Tucker Carlson podcast recorded with the anti-American Colonel Douglas McGregor responding to the Ukraine-U.S. deal. And I suspect that the reason this was an emergency podcast was the Tucker Carlson faction is alarmed that America and Ukraine are now aligned again, and the aid is flowing. So I think this was yesterday was a good day for Ukraine, and it was a good day for America, but we don't know what tomorrow will bring.
Okay, well, thank you very much for answering that question. Now,
Yes.
let's move on to the two ad campaigns out of the administration that were launched yesterday. One for a car company and one for a fast food joint I thought had long been gone, like had disappeared from the face of the earth, because I haven't seen one in many years. That is Steak and Shake. You'll be happy to know that Steak and Shake announced that it was substituting beef tallow for vegetable oil in the making of its French fries. Now, this is bad news for those of us who keep kosher. Beef tallow means that you can't eat French fries because beef tallow is not kosher. And so, when McDonald's shifted from beef tallow to vegetable oil, suddenly not people who like keep rigorously Orthodox kosher and will not eat at a place that isn't a fully kosher establishment, but people who do keep kosher but will be, will eat out at non-kosher places could have McDonald's French fries. And I think McDonald's also went back to beef tallow.
Okay. Among the modern Orthodox, the question of the French fries is like a famous one.
It's very big. It's very, very big.
And you're wandering around, what is the French frying process at these, random places?
So I don't really think that Steak and Shake has a large kosher population that is thirsty. As I said, didn't even know that it still existed. Nonetheless, RFK, our Health and Human Services Secretary, did a public event praising Steak and Shake because, as you may know, hydrogenated vegetable oil is an evil that is murdering tens of billions of people and is taking people out, causing obesity, destroying human lives, destroying our intestinal systems and all of that. And so he essentially made a commercial for Steak and Shake, praising Steak and Shake, giving them tens of millions of dollars of free publicity on Fox, because he went to, I think, on Hannity and talked about this. So that was ad number one. Maybe he can continue to go on finding places like the Ground Round and Shoney's.
We should just say this is in the middle of a measles outbreak in Texas, and that's already claimed the life of one child. So it's a question of priorities here as well.
Yes.
He's not focusing so much on the measles outbreak.
Well, look, one child may die of measles, but 25 billion children have died from vaccines, as you may know, according to RFK, who is now canceling programs to promote vaccines or to sort of figure out why people. Now, this is not so bad. When we heard that HHS was canceling some kind of a study, trying to figure out why people are increasingly not getting vaccinated, you can understand what that's about, right? That is actually kind of like the disinformation programs of the Biden administration, which is we need to figure out why Americans are so stupid and brainwash them into doing the right
The answer
thing.
is pretty obvious why there's more. Well, at least in some quarters, there's more vaccine hesitancy because of the COVID vaccine.
Right.
That's why people got it and it didn't work. They still got COVID.
Right. That's one thing. And that's big. All sorts of things. But as I say, I think this was part of the general idea of the Biden health and general assault on the notion that the American people are grown-ups who can make decisions for themselves, and that they only make these decisions because they're being led by monsters, and that the government is the right forum to properly rebalance their understanding of things. Now, I think anti-vax stuff is terrible, and it's terrible for children. I hope people don't fall prey to it, but it is, and the fact that we have a Health and Human Services Secretary who seems to be at root opposed to vaccination, though he said otherwise in his confirmation hearing, is a dreadful development. Nonetheless,
we should at least acknowledge, by the way, that he wrote a Fox News op-ed when the measles outbreak hit that
3 weeks ago.
said,
Yeah.
it's up to you, but
Yeah.
the measles vaccine will keep you alive instead of dead. Like that was basically what
I
it
think that's the one time he said
yeah,
that.
that was the one that was
Yeah.
viewed,
Fox
and
News
people
op-ed.
were like, oh well, he
Yeah.
didn't say you should get the vaccine. It's like, look, baby steps. RFK Jr. said this vaccine is good and will probably protect you from the outbreak. So maybe he can be nudged far enough in the right direction to contain.
Right.
Yeah.
But until then, like I say, there are burger joints all over America that could really use a helping hand and free advertising.
So that's ad number one.
That's ad number one. So now let's go to ad number two.
Ad number two was the ad for Tesla on the White House lawn, where President Trump, having made a pledge to buy a Tesla, and I'll just note here, as of 8:22 a.m. on Wednesday, March 12th, I've seen no evidence that Donald Trump has actually bought the Tesla. But he says he's going to buy a Tesla. And so Elon Musk arranged a variety of Tesla models to appear in the White House driveway. And President Trump went out and inspected them along with Musk. Trump seems to have really liked the Model S, I believe. It's a very sleek design, and he got in it. And he otherwise praised his buddy, the first buddy, who also, maybe just coincidentally, pledged yesterday to spend about $100 million on Trump-aligned political action committees and political outreach instruments and such. It was quite a scene on the White House lawn, and I think the thread between the two commercials, John, is that we have a Republican administration praising beef tallow and electric vehicles. And you might just wake up and say, how is this a Republican administration? What? But it's a sign of how Donald Trump has changed American politics and the Republican Party. The Republican coalition now is a coalition that includes RFK Jr. and Elon Musk. And Trump is definitely leaning hard into that part of the Republican coalition, where the more traditional parts of the Republicans are looking for shelter amidst the trade war.
We should also, there's a reason he's doing this with Tesla, and that's because Musk's participation in his government is hurting Tesla's bottom line. And I think Trump doesn't want that association, right? He doesn't want it to be like, well, if you come work for the Trump administration, your stock plummets and things like that too.
Yeah, I think he's turning it into a culture war symbol.
Yeah,
I think so too, and I think the protesters are doing that
now.
As well.
Because the left started it, right? Because there have been these cases of vandalism against Teslas, or people who own or drive Teslas are being harassed. They're being called Nazis. So Trump is responding to that by appropriating the Tesla as a MAGA sign, which again is kind of ironic considering this is the man who rightly campaigned against and ended the electric vehicle mandate.
If you want to be a good Republican, drive an EV. That's the obvious message.
It's great. It's amazing.
It is more than ironic. It is the transvaluation of all values. Like there was a South Park episode from 15 years ago where people who own electric vehicles are so proud of themselves for their virtue signaling that they literally smell their own farts like that. They love their own because they're just so wonderful. That was the sort of, if you could say that South Park, weirdly enough, this part of the Republican coalition, kind of the South Park conservatives that Brian Anderson wrote about in a book he published in the late 2000s. The notion of the virtue signaling capitalist purchase of high-end luxury goods that cost twice as much as the goods that ordinary people can pay for in order to make themselves feel better, that this has migrated from left to right is a little vertiginous, and it does not compute. It again does not fit with the fact that this administration got itself into power by saying it was going to lower prices and pay attention to what people who were suffering during the Biden years from the run-up in inflation and prices, which does not affect people, or affects people in very limited ways at the highest end of the income scale. Only people who buy Teslas, that this is where he's going. It's understandable. The Trump-Musk relationship is becoming something psychologically peculiar to me. Musk is playing too large a role in Trump's mind. One thing for him to be used or deployed by liberals to talk about how the depredations that Trump is visiting upon the federal government and what people need from the federal government. But Musk has also occupied a significant amount of the brain matter of Donald Trump. He talks about him. He has him praised there all the time.
He really likes him.
About him he really likes him. It's getting weird though. It's like weird.
I don't think Trump has ever had this close of a friend. To be honest with you,
he has so many friends.
I know he has many.
It's very
remember
hard
when
for
he
adult
first
men to make new friends. You know,
it is.
It's true.
And when he first ran for office, I remember in 2015, people were all like, "Well, it's not clear who he's friends with." And there were like people from Palm Beach that he kind of knew, and there were people from New York that he kind of knew. Obviously, he was this very famous person, and I was just reading some account of a party in the 90s. Oh, in an SNL oral history, and Trump was at the party, just kind of hanging. He was everywhere, but it wasn't clear he had any solid relationships. And now he does. now he has this guy who just happens to be the most richest man in the world.
But they share a unique bond in that they are both so hated. That I'm sure is like very solidifying.
The heat shield factor, I think, is real, and I think Trump understands that.
Okay, fair enough.
Because of Elon's association with Trump. I mean, he wasn't really hated like this.
Elon?
Oh no, he was. He was, because
Twitter was the change.
No, even before.
But he went MAGA on Twitter
when he hosted Saturday Night Live. Musk, which was, I don't even
22,
maybe 22. Half the people complained they didn't want him. He was not yet on the right. He was not considered a right winger, but he was hated then too. I'm not quite sure. Can't remember what the circumstances were. It may have been that he was like an oligarch, or they didn't want to have this multi-billionaire on or whatever. But writers,
he made one of the regular cast members cry. That was
right. No, but that was during the show. But hold on, let me see when this was. When did he go on SNL? Oh, come on. One sec. This is impossible. Sorry. Okay. This is getting me confused because now it's all about Mike Myers playing him, and I'm looking it up. Anyway, whatever is the case, he was already disliked by mainstream liberals in the early
2021.
2021. Okay, so maybe
I think he bought Twitter the next year.
Right. So he was not yet the owner of Twitter, but he was inveighing against PC a little. He'd already started talking about how PC was bad or stuff like that. But I don't know. I'm just saying he has been a disliked figure for many years in sort of the mainstream. And so the heat shield built up over time before he threw his cards in with Trump. Let's talk about the $100 million. Weird stuff is going on here, and this is yet another example of how the unbelievable failure of Democrats to take the measure of Trump in their war against Trump in the first term and to deal with him appropriately during the interregnum between the first and the second terms, or to act in ways that were actually going to get him elected, between the first and second terms have really backfired, because there is stuff going on that would be potentially deserving of serious investigation into impeachment. Like stuff that gets very uncomfortably close to emoluments, to trade-offs of the president's time for money, stuff going on with his family, all of that is way more what would you call it, nervy than the stuff that went on in the first term, which a lot of which had to do with whether people stayed at the Trump hotel in DC. Now, my view is that my guess is that Donald Jr. and various other members of the family who seem to be looking in with investment firms and other things to take advantage of the Trump name have in their own heads, like, well, Hunter Biden, look at Hunter Biden, don't talk to me like I am too, don't play this game with me. But nonetheless, things are getting very weird, and the relationship with Musk is a walking, talking conflict of interest of a sort that we haven't seen in many decades in Washington. Right? Yeah. Like in the 1940s, when World War II was on, these famous industrialists threw in their cards with the administration to help win the war effort. Right? They were called the dollar a year men, people who led major industries, who were brought in at a moment when we had a command economy to help organize the command economy, to build tanks, to do all that stuff. And they did not have a conflict of interest, weirdly enough, because their own businesses tended not to be involved in what was going on with this command economy, and they certainly weren't, like profiteering in this. Not that Musk is profiteering, but this is not normal. This is really, really, really not normal. And the Democrats have completely, and liberals have completely made it impossible for them, because of the Chicken Little problem.
Well, the Democrats they have no power, and the mainstream media has very little credibility, and so there are very few points of leverage against the current administration. And I think the Trump administration understands that. That's why this kind of mad scramble quality to the administration is happening. Because in the back of many Republicans' minds, there's a sense that, well, we only really have 2 years before the Democrats have a real chance of taking the House of Representatives. And then if the Democrats have the gavels and have the subpoena power, well, then we know what they're going to do. They're going to launch all these investigations. They're going to go after Trump. They're going to go after Musk. So there's a kind of a hastiness to what the Trump administration is doing in every quarter, whether that's foreign policy, whether that's domestic policy, whether that's some of the political activity or financial activity that's happening, because there's always in the back of their minds this kind of sword of Damocles hanging over them.
Right, but that doesn't explain. So the other way you could look at it then is that if they're profiteering, they got to shove all the profiteering into the first 2 years, right? Because the next 2 years are going to be just investigation, like every single congressional House committee is going to be investigating, and they're going to have more meat on the bones than the Russia investigation, which of course was a fraud.
Now the problem is, as of we're about to have spring of 2025, the Democrats are nowhere close to getting their act together. So
that's where we need to go now.
Yeah. So that would be a problem it would be a problem for the Democrats and for people who are, want less corruption in government. If actually the Republicans control the Congress throughout Trump's presidency, then there will be very little accountability.
So Ed, let's talk about this.
I think on that subject, right? Hakeem Jeffries is a key player. Right, the floor leader.
So he's the minority leader of the House. He's the leading Democrat in the House.
He's the leading Democrat in the House, taking over for Pelosi essentially as the floor general. And his strategy pre-Trump, pre this election, seemed to be just stand back, like Napoleon said, and let the Republicans spin out on their own and just don't get in the way, right? When Republicans were having what seemed like weekly votes over the Speaker of the House and, ousting speaker after speaker, Hakeem Jeffries took some flack at one point for telling his caucus not to save Republican candidates for speaker, not to make a deal, not to, just say like this is their problem. And for a while it worked because Republicans really were eating their own. I mean, Matt Gaetz, started that whole process. And they had that rule at the time where it took one person basically to get a sort of vote of confidence on the speakership. And Hakeem Jeffries was able to sit back and watch that happen. And that seems to be the thing that has changed, right? Trump is not Kevin McCarthy for all, for his pros and cons. Trump operates in a very different way. He gives orders and people get in line, and the party got in line, and the party is doing things. And it's gone in mere, half a year from the type of party that can't elect a floor speaker to the type of party that is cutting like a hot knife through butter through the federal government, through every department and spending, going after universities, doing this, that. I mean, getting the ceasefire deal and in the Middle East saying we're going to take Gaza. I mean, it turned into a machine. What feels like if you're Hakeem Jeffries overnight, and it makes his previous strategy completely irrelevant, and he hasn't come up with a new one.
Well, so let's talk culturally about the Democrats, not just procedurally, and we could talk a little about the continuing resolution or the keeping the lights on in the federal government. But culturally, Democrats are off kilter, as far as I can tell. And the latest example of this is this seeming decision on the part of the mainstream media primarily, but also some politicians, and then the kind of like the crowd, the Democratic leftist crowd, to take up the cudgel for Mahmud Khalil, the guy taken into custody by ICE for his support of Hamas on the Columbia and Barnard campuses. So today, as I'm speaking at 11:30 this morning, Judge Furman in New York will hear testimony or whatever. Try to make sense out of this question of Khalil's green card. Does that mean that Marco Rubio, under the 1952 provisions of a law passed in 1952, has this is the word I cannot pronounce, unjusticiable right to expel?
That was good.
Thank you. To expel this guy. There's nothing in the law governing these immigration statutes that provides the courts with review. Nonetheless, some stuff's going to happen here today that we don't know about. What we do know is that the New York Times and the Washington Post and the networks and all of that are effectively on Mahmud Khalil's side. And they're not just on his side because they're saying he is noxious and a supporter of monstrosity, but this is a matter of criminalizing speech. And if you go after him, eventually they can come after you. They're saying Trump is running roughshod over the law, and this guy didn't really do anything wrong. He was never arrested. So because he wasn't arrested and he has a green card, no one should say that he has done anything wrong, and he's the one who has been wronged here.
This is one of those things that applies to liberals and conservatives, just in different cases. It applies to everyone. Americans love adopting that posture. They love being righteous, about saying, I disagree with everything you say, but I'll fight to the death for your right to say it.
Voltaire. Yeah,
like
our many Voltaires.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is so satisfying a hill to die on that's why I could see I see it catching now all around me in this case.
I'd like to introduce all these people to my friend Andrew C. McCarthy, who has written extensively now on the subject of Khalil in a piece for National Review, and now this morning in a piece for Fox News. And I think that Andy's read on the law is pretty clear, that the government retains the right to deport a green card holder if the government views that green card holder as someone who is a threat to the country. And it's not a question of speech. It's a question of conduct and affiliation. And this, I think, is a pretty clear reading of the law.
When you apply for immigration status, and of course, getting a green card requires an application. You have an application. You sign it at the bottom, like all government documents, famous Statute 1001. That means that if you lie on the document, you are committing a crime. And one of the many things that you have to testify to, and maybe also in hearings, is, are you affiliated with authoritarian organizations who do not have the best interests of the United States at heart? And if you say, no, I am not affiliated with any such organizations or a supporter of any such organizations, you can move on to the next stage. Mahmud Khalil must have said, I have no such feelings. Therefore, he lied on his green card application, which is something that has not yet come up. But he said, this is the famous thing, right? Are you a communist? You cannot apply, you cannot have immigration status in the United States in the late 40s and 50s is a big thing. Like, if you say that you support they say, are you now or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party anywhere? Right? You say no. Do you support the aims of the Communist Party or of authoritarian organization? That was a way of getting in fascism and Nazism in there too. So Andy doesn't even really quite get to this point, but he may have falsified his green card application, is my point. That's number one. Number two, apparently, according to the law, Rubio, the Secretary of State, has the power to make this determination that is, as I say, anyway, but there is this one
indivisible
sentence
with liberty and justice.
Thank you. Yes. There is this one sentence in the law that Andy keeps citing that modifies this to some small degree. And because he is a green card holder, apparently the tradition has been to say that he has the right to a hearing before an immigration judge. Jesse Furman, the judge in this case, whom I am obliged by full disclosure to say is a friend of mine and is somebody that I am personally associated with. Jesse Furman is not an immigration judge, but he is holding this hearing, so I guess he'll stand in for that. And fine. So the question, there's a question about whether or not the administration screwed up in how it approached this matter and didn't, as we said yesterday, dot its I's and cross its T's and make sure that they were taking him into custody under the right rules, because the ICE agents told Mahmud Khalil that he was being brought in because he had violated the terms of his student visa, and he's not on a student visa. So they got it wrong. They didn't handle it right. And that's led to some of this confusion. But it will be very interesting to see, because just because the law says the judge doesn't have a right, the judges can assert the right, and then an appeals court or the Supreme Court will have to be the final arbiters of this matter. But let's go back to the cultural question, which is, maybe I don't understand America anymore, and that's fine, because I'll go crying in the corner about this. But are they crazy? This guy's a supporter of Hamas. By the way, Gallup says that Democrats now are more sympathetic to Palestinians than they are to Israelis. That was last week's shock poll. That's not Israel versus Hamas. That is the Palestinians writ large. I don't think that there is any polling data to suggest that Democrats support Hamas. People in Dearborn, Michigan may support Hamas.
No, they've asked this. I mean, the Harvard has asked this question
Right.
monthly, and there's no,
No, it's like
they actually
4% or
Harvard
6%.
specifically asks, Israel versus Hamas, and yes, there's no support
And
for Hamas.
he's a member of 2 fan clubs. Part of the Hamas fan club and part of the Hezbollah fan club. And what do we know about Hezbollah? 42 years ago, Hezbollah murdered 241 Marines in a barracks in Lebanon. So let's just be clear about this. They are handing Republicans the rope to hang them with. This is a sticky issue. And if the idea is, and they're trying to get right on the border and on immigration a little bit here and there, going into 2026, you want the Democratic Party, liberals, you want to hand Republicans the thing where they can say, you know what Democrats really like or liberals really like? They love foreign nationals who support terrorism and foment disorder and decay on campuses, blocking Jewish students from the right to walk into buildings and go to class and have class. This is a border. This is an immigration issue. It's not.
And what's even nuttier is it's almost unforced on the part of the Democrats. I mean, the Democrats could approach this and say, "Look, this is a complicated question. We want to make sure that people's civil liberties are respected. Everyone deserves the due process of the law. Let's see what happens." But instead, you have these tweets from the Democratic Party saying, "Free Khalil." It says there's no question, and so he's a political prisoner. And so this rush to hug him is what's bizarre and completely they didn't need to do that. They could just say, "Well, we're going to follow the law. We want to make sure everything is good. We of course deplore what's been going on campuses." No, not at all. They go to the extreme immediately. Yeah. And it's not just on this issue. It's on the trans issues as well. I mean, there's just almost this wish to fail on the part of the Democrats that they move toward these extreme positions so effortlessly. Now, clearly they think they're in the right. They have this sense, their moral universe, such as it is, paints a picture where he is a political prisoner. But what you would hope for from a responsible political party is that someone there would say, well, let's just take a minute and understand that the way that the people who have the "in this house" signs on their front lawns don't actually represent the United States of America's electorate. And you would think that they would learn that lesson in November, but they clearly haven't.
But this goes back. I mean, to me, this goes back 50-something years. Isn't this the same as celebrating the Panthers or other,
Yes.
domestic terrorists or terrorist supporters or, internal communist groups? Like they it's their favorite thing is to embrace.
And look at the consequences.
Radicals who get caught.
Look at the electoral consequences for the Democratic Party from the late 60s to the early 90s. Again, if you accept Watergate, because Watergate was this one-off moment that sort of gave ectopic life to a Democratic Party that was in an unbelievable swoon that lasted very, very briefly. So with the exception of gerrymandering, nationally, Democratic Party lost an election by 25 points in 1972, won an election by 1.5 points in 1976, lost an election by 10 in 80, lost an election by 20 in 84, and lost an election in 88 by 8. While the Republicans managed to win the Senate back in 1980 with a 12-seat gain. That's the Democratic Party after it embraced its radical side after the 1960s. That's what I'm referring to. Now, we're not the same country. It's a set of different circumstances. History may rhyme, but it doesn't necessarily repeat. But yeah, however, I will say this one thing that makes me a little anxious. So Andrew Cuomo, as you may know, is running for mayor of New York City. having resigned in disgrace because of charges of sexual misconduct, though really because of his mishandling of COVID, or his incredibly heavy-handed handling of COVID, which is what really turned people off, in my view. He's now running as the common sense candidate, started a group to combat anti-Semitism, blah, 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 right? And he came into the race last week. He has said nothing about Mahmud Khalil. This is in New York City. This arrest took place, 30 blocks from my house in New York City. That's Cuomo, who should be jumping on this, isn't. And that makes me
shouldn't
anxious.
Be jumping on it, because by politically, the logic I laid out, he should not be jumping on it. So he's doing the politically smart thing by being silent.
Fair enough. Okay. Or
I think John is saying he would be playing the moderate. He would be playing the sensible Democrat who's saying this guy is a bad guy. Why are you defending him?
Yeah. Or right. I mean, I don't know. I think his political strategy is to be everybody's second choice and a lot of people's first choice, because we have ranked choice voting in New York, and that he expects to run up numbers in white ethnic enclaves in Brooklyn, Queens, and Staten Island to get him his party's nomination in June. And prudence has dictated to him that he keep his mouth shut. And I don't know. That makes me nervous, because it strikes me that it's kind of a gimme to say, I don't really know. I don't know what the law here is, and I will abide. I respect judge for whatever. We'll see what happens. But what this guy stands for is disgusting, and I hold no truck with it. He could have said that. He didn't. He isn't, because I think he's worried. He doesn't understand what the shifting politics inside the Democratic electorate in the primary are going to be. And I trust politicians to take care of their own, what would you call it? Like, they have animal cunning sense of what is and what is not, where they should stand at any given moment. And if Cuomo's animal cunning is telling him to keep out of it, I wish that were not the case. That does worry me about.
I understand what you're saying, but I would take his silence over him joining the jackals defending Khalil.
I do. But I just think
there's another New York politician that we should talk about in this sense, and that's Chuck Schumer, right? I mean, Chuck
Schumer has a book coming out about anti-Semitism. Right. So I just
want
you to know
part of what is so bothersome about the Democratic response is epitomized by Schumer, and I think it's closely related to the point that Abe made about wanting to be able to defend someone you disagree with, so you look reasonable. But Schumer's response was to say, I deplore anti-Semitism. I've been calling out anti-Semitism, and I deplore everything this guy stands for. But and this is the part of the trend that we've seen now for 16 and a half months, which is you only get a denunciation of anti-Semitism from a Democrat if they're in the process of denouncing anti-Arab or anti-Muslim discrimination. Right?
It's true.
You wait until there's a both sides.
You have to have both sides.
Chuck Schumer didn't deplore anti-Semitism. He's been missing in action. He hasn't been good on this issue. He hasn't been stridently defending his people. We've been documenting that relentlessly at the website. This is the opportunity for him to say, oh, by the way, anti-Semitism. But really, it's because he's defending an anti-Semite.
Well put. We haven't talked about the halving of the Department of Education, which apparently began this morning. 1,300 people being laid off at the Department of Education.
Which I now know how many employees the Department of Education had.
Right,
I had no idea.
Okay,
2,600 people.
For my pains, for reasons that I don't entirely understand, I do get Politico's morning Illinois newsletter. The Illinois playbook.
Are you sure it's not a USAID subscription, John? Are you part of the deep state cabal?
I want to read to you what is here because I think it suggests why this is again like an absolutely brilliant populist political play. What's going on here? I know it'll look messy and it looks like Trump doesn't care about education. Republicans hate education. But I just want to read you the opening passage here, and then we can bring proceedings to a close today. Bringing the axe, reports Shia Kapos, the author of the Illinois Playbook. The U.S. Department of Education's announcement Tuesday that it was firing more than 1,300 workers drew a swift rebuke from Governor J.B. Pritzker and education leaders across Illinois. Donald Trump is failing the test of leadership again. Instead of proposing any plans to improve math and reading scores, he's tearing down the Department of Education, then making it harder for working class kids to get ahead, the governor said in a statement. Deeply harmful is how Illinois Education Association president, that's the teachers union, Al Lawrence, described the cuts to Illinois students. More than 1,000 Illinois school districts receive Title I monies, which are funds set aside to help schools with the most impoverished students. This money helps 960,095 students in our state, according to the association. And there's more. Okay. So the Department of Education has existed since 1979, I believe. And how, Matt, have these scores gone?
They've gone
since 1979.
Down.
How have the scores been since Joe Biden took over the government in 2021? Where is the National Association? There's the National Assessment of Educational Progress, NAEP, on reading and math. This is money that has been spent badly and at the federal level has gone to nonsense and horror and bad guidance for schools. And if they want, Republicans have stayed away from this, even though we talk about it amongst ourselves, because they don't want to look like they're bad on education. I think saying the status quo is unacceptable and that we need to do something radical about education is something that is, again, would be a 70% issue if it were polled.
You know, Republicans have actually been gaining an advantage on the issue of education since the pandemic, slightly even before the pandemic. And I don't think that the attempt to close the Department of Education, and maybe even the successful attempt at the rate that the administration is going, will harm those numbers. I mean, education is now, I think, separated from what the federal government does. People care about their schools if they go to a public school, of course, but there are so many other options. You have the growth now of education freedom movements in, I think, more than a dozen states now where the state government funds the student, not the school system. You have, of course, rising homeschools, different pods and modules and the way people learn. I think American parents understand that the government is not going to provide their children an adequate education. And so they either have to demand the schools, their community schools, live up to high standards, or they're going to look elsewhere. And I mean, the global point, as our previous president might say, is that these structures have all failed. That's, you know, it's like Trump is coming in, he's uprooting everything. He has 2 years to do it. But the truth is, what has the Department of Education done? It's done nothing. Americans are dumb. I was complaining about this on Monday. I mean, they're getting dumber by the day. The more money isn't going to solve it. It all goes to administrators. That's why the protest is so loud.
Right.
It's their money. They don't want to see their money go away. They don't want to see the money that sustains a failing system go away. That's why they're upset.
Right. Now, so we have two constituencies that the Trump moves speak to, which I think are interesting. One, as you say, are concerned parents who see that the schools are failing their kids. And then the other is the fact that there's an enormous number of people in this country now who don't have kids. They're not going to have kids, they don't have kids, or their kids are grown and they don't have grandchildren because their kids aren't having kids. And they don't want their money spent on this either. Like, it's their money, it's their tax money. Maybe they want it for themselves. Maybe they wanted to shore up Social Security, whatever, all that stuff you hear about. When you hear that the teachers' unions and Democratic politicians are saying that this is going to harm kids, and that the obvious answer is prove it. You just had this enormous experiment where you guys were in charge of the school system and said, no, it's going to be fine for there to be a year worth of schooling.
Year
remotely.
plus no school was fine for the kids.
No,
and laying off people at the Department of Education would be bad for kids.
Yeah. I don't think that argument is going to be very successful. 15 years ago, it might have been like Republicans stayed away from outside, again, of our precincts or talking about the Republican platform and stuff, tended to stay away from talking about closing the education department because it was too easy to hand this issue to their rivals to say you don't care about education. But it's increasingly not a huge deal to say you don't care about education because of the largely Democratic world's.
Yeah, well, all I would say is they do care about education, and that's why the education establishment has to be overthrown and defunded.
Right.
The only aspect of this I think that could, I'm not saying it will, could hurt Republicans is less specific. I think it's the idea that people are uncomfortable with dramatic, large scale change like this. When they hear that a whole department is on the chopping block, people think, "Oh my, what's happening? I don't recognize the world. I don't recognize my country.
Right.
This is aggressive and dramatic." But aside from that,
Americans have spent 20 years reading about layoffs. So if you hear that 1,300 people are being laid off at the education department, and you live in a place where people are laid off from companies and businesses, and you have relatives who have been laid off and all of that, that number, it's not 100,000 people. It's 1,300 people. It is startling because it doesn't happen in government hardly ever, but it's not, the number isn't like gobstopping. I mean,
no, but I mean, you live like I live in the vicinity, right, of DC area, in a place where it's not DC. I live in Maryland, but obviously lots of federal workers live out here. And there was a note from one of the synagogue rabbis that went around a week or so ago about counseling and help and the process of mass unemployment and all this other stuff. It felt like a note that went out during COVID when everything closed and things like that. It also felt a bit like the fall of 2008, when the housing market plummeted and things started going back. I mean, like, there was, if you live in certain areas, there is a feeling of, okay, the community needs help and services, and that makes it feel like there's not a recession nationwide, but your town feels in recession.
I think the issue is that for 30 some years, our area, Seth, the DMV, the District Northern Virginia and Maryland, has amassed so much power and wealth unto itself that it has become almost a separate country from the rest of the United States of America. And what is happening now is that Elon Musk and Donald Trump are treating the metropole, the nation's capital, like the rest of the country for once. And that is, you're right, that's painful. But I don't think most Americans are going to say, "Oh, stop," because if you leave the nation's capital and its surrounding counties, you enter a very different country, which has to deal with layoffs all the time.
Yeah.
Right. Well, that's a key point, right? Which is that the DMV has been immune to actual recessions in a way that the rest of the country hasn't been. So the feeling that a recession is descending just on these communities, lots of nice people who are losing jobs. I mean, these are not, they're not the ones who made Washington that way. But yeah, for these communities, it's also, it may not actually feel like past recessions, because past recessions may not have felt like this. It may be
it's the opposite.
Someone's getting a letter from their rabbi saying, whoever, if you need help, reach out.
Yeah, but the metropole, the whole point is not only that it was immune, but that particularly after 2008, it was its wealth increased
Growing.
vastly
Yes.
because of in 2008 and from 2021 to 2025, the vast amounts of increases in federal spending disproportionately were spent in this relatively small area of about 4.5 million people. It's not California. It's, 4 suburban counties and the District of Columbia, which is a city of 500,000 people. And those counties, like one of them was poor when I lived there in the 1980s, like Prince William County and Loudoun County in Virginia were not well-to-do.
Well, Loudoun was a rural county in the
Loudoun
1980s.
was a rural county. These are now, I think, among all those counties are among the top 10.
Loudoun's one of the richest counties in the country now.
Right. So there's been a transformation by government spending.
And that's what the Trump phenomenon is about. That's why we have Donald Trump, is because the rest of the country looks at this place and says, what are you doing?
Right.
And now finally, he is treating the country, the metropole, as the rest of the country has been living since the 2000. And
so let's see if he can make that case, because of course J.B. Pritzker and the teachers unions are going to make the counter case, and so the argument has to be made.
People are fleeing J.B. Pritzker's state.
I know.
Like the idea that somehow he is a model of governance is completely absurd.
Yeah, and of course the mayor of Chicago
has a 4%
approval rating.
So we should listen to him.
I know. Anyway, we need to go, but I do want to mention one thing, which is that the inflation numbers came out as we were talking, and it's the first good piece of economic news that Trump has had in the court. Particularly given what's gone on in the last week, inflation declined by 0.2%, which is about 7% overall in this CPI reading, and so he at least is going to take some kind of a victory lap, that his efforts are now having some positive effect on inflation. Even if he doesn't really deserve to take that victory lap, he would be getting, the world would come down on his head if it was going the other way, right? If it went up from 3 to 3.2.
This is good news for the Trump administration.
It is very good news for the Trump administration. And so, and as I say, we've been talking about the chaos for a week, and the stock market declined, and there may be a huge reversal in the stock market today because of the inflation number. Who knows? Anyhow, I don't think we have a recommendation today, so we will be back tomorrow. For Abe, Seth, and Matt, I'm John Podhoretz. Keep the camera on.